Picture a world not so long ago where maps still held vast blank spaces marked only by the words unexplored or here be monsters. One of the last great unknown territories was the Amazon rainforest, a place of breathtaking beauty and unimaginable danger. It was a green ocean of trees hiding secrets that had swallowed countless lives, and in the early 20th century, one man became utterly obsessed with solving its greatest mystery. His name was Colonel Percy Fawcett, a British explorer who ventured into that immense wilderness in search of a fabled ancient civilization he called the Lost City of Z. What he found or didn't find would ignite a mystery that continues to baffle historians, archaeologists, and adventurers to this very day. Percy Fawcett was no ordinary fortune seeker. He was a seasoned surveyor, a man of science and iron will, trusted by governments and geographical societies. But something happened during his early expeditions deep into the Amazon basin that convinced him he was on the verge of a discovery that would rewrite history. He wasn't hunting for gold or treasure in the traditional sense. He was searching for proof of a sophisticated, advanced culture that predated all known civilizations in the Americas. He called this place Z, and his belief in it was so absolute that he was willing to risk everything, including his life and the lives of those who followed him, to prove it was real. In 1925, Fawcett embarked on his final expedition into the Brazilian rainforest with his eldest son Jack and Jack's best friend Rolly Rimmel. They were never seen again. Not a body, not a journal, not a single piece of equipment was ever conclusively found. Their disappearance became one of the most famous vanishing acts of the 20th century, sparking a century-long obsession that would claim the lives of over 100 subsequent explorers who went looking for clues. What happened to Percy Fawcett? Was he killed by hostile tribes? Did he succumb to disease or the unforgiving jungle? Or did he actually find what he was looking for and choose never to return? This is the story of obsession, courage, and one of history's most enduring enigmas. To understand the unshakable determination that would later define him, we have to go back to the beginning, to the boy who would become the legend. Percy Harrison Fawcett was born in 1867 in Torquay, England, into a family where adventure seemed to run in the blood. His father was a member of the Royal Geographical Society, a prestigious institution that was at the time the epicenter of global exploration. From a young age, Percy was immersed in tales of distant lands and daring expeditions, planting a seed of profound wanderlust. But his path to becoming an explorer wasn't a straight line. It was forged in the rigid discipline and global theaters of the British military. He attended the Royal Military Academy, Woolwich, and was commissioned as an officer in the Royal Artillery. This military background is crucial. It didn't just teach him how to lead men. It instilled in him a sense of meticulous order, resilience, and an almost stoic tolerance for hardship that would become his greatest assets in the jungle. His postings read like a catalogue of the far-flung corners of the British Empire, each one serving as a brutal but effective training ground. He was stationed in Ceylon, now known as Sri Lanka, where he first encountered the complexities of navigating unfamiliar cultures and dense tropical terrain. Later, he served in North Africa and Malta, environments that were harsh, unforgiving, and demanded incredible self-reliance. It was in these postings that Fawcett honed his skills in surveying and map-making, the very crafts that would later make him invaluable to the Geographical Society's funding expeditions. More importantly, these experiences stripped away any romantic illusions he might have had about travel. He learned that true exploration was less about discovery and more about sheer survival, a daily grind against the elements, disease, and isolation. Yet there was another side to Fawcett that set him apart from his fellow officers. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a man deeply fascinated by the occult and the mystical. He was a member of groups like the Theosophical Society, which explored spiritual philosophies and the idea of ancient, lost wisdom. This unique combination is the key to understanding the man. The rigid, pragmatic military surveyor existed alongside a romantic idealist who believed in hidden truths and forgotten worlds. It was this powerful duality that made him the perfect candidate for the missions that would come next. When the Royal Geographical Society needed a man of impeccable discipline who also possessed the imagination to believe in the impossible for a mapping expedition to the South American interior, Percy Fawcett was their only choice. He wasn't just prepared for the unknown, his entire life had been a rehearsal for it. The Royal Geographical Society in London was the command centre for the world's greatest age of exploration, and it was here that Percy Fawcett's destiny truly took shape. In 1906, the Society was presented with a particularly thorny problem. Bolivia and Brazil were locked in a tense border dispute over a vast and almost completely uncharted region of the Amazon basin. This was not a job for a mere cartographer. It required a unique individual, part diplomat, part scientist, and part survivalist. The Society needed someone who could not only endure unimaginable physical hardship, but also navigate the complex political landscape, accurately mapping a border that existed only on paper. Given his impeccable military record, his proven surveying skills, and his unusual fascination with the esoteric, Fawcett was the obvious, if somewhat unconventional, choice. His mission was clear, yet staggeringly difficult: to travel into the heart of the continent and definitively map the watershed between the Rio Verde and Rio Guapare rivers, thereby establishing a clear border. The journey was a brutal introduction to the Amazon's unforgiving nature. Fawcett and his team faced a gauntlet of perils that would have broken lesser men. They were constantly plagued by swarms of biting insects, from mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever to tiny sandflies that could drive a person to madness. The jungle itself was a labyrinth of thorny vegetation and treacherous swamps, where every step required exhausting effort. They faced jaguars, giant anacondas, and rivers teeming with piranhas and parasitic kangaroo fish. Perhaps most terrifying of all were the reports of hostile indigenous tribes who were understandably wary of these foreign intruders. Yet, where others saw only hardship and danger, Fawcett began to see something else entirely: tantalizing clues. It was on this first expedition that he began hearing the stories that would consume the rest of his life. From local rubber tappers and missionaries, and occasionally from cautious but curious indigenous guides, he heard fragments of legend. They spoke of ancient stone ruins hidden deep in the jungle, of overgrown roads that led nowhere, and of a magnificent, glittering lost city that held untold knowledge and wealth. These weren't just campfire tales to Fawcett, they were pieces of a historical puzzle. He started to believe that the Amazon was not a pristine wilderness, but a graveyard for a magnificent, sophisticated civilization that had been wiped out by disease or cataclysm centuries before. This idea was considered heretical at the time. Most contemporary scientists believed the Amazon's poor soil could never have supported a large, complex society. But Fawcett, the military man who trusted empirical evidence, was convinced the rumors he collected were that evidence. He also returned with something that would become a cornerstone of his legend: a small, intricately carved stone idol given to him by a sympathetic rubber baron. Fawcett believed the idol was of ancient origin, possibly from the civilization he sought, and he would later have it analyzed by a psychometrist, a person who claimed to read an object's history through touch. The psychometrist's dramatic vision of a vast, temple-filled city surrounded by mountains only solidified Fawcett's conviction. This first expedition was the catalyst. It transformed him from a competent surveyor on a government mission into a man possessed by a singular, all-consuming quest. He had mapped the border successfully, earning praise from the Society, but he had also mapped the beginnings of a personal obsession. The green hell of the Amazon had not broken him. It had whispered its deepest secret to him, and he was determined to answer. Fawcett's conviction wasn't born from a single moment of discovery, but from a slow, deliberate synthesis of disparate clues he gathered over years. He became a historical detective, piecing together a theory that connected crumbling Portuguese colonial documents, forgotten 18th century manuscripts, and the oral histories of the Amazon's indigenous peoples. This intellectual journey transformed his quest from a wild gamble into a reasoned, evidence-based pursuit, at least in his own mind. The central piece of this puzzle was a document known as Manuscript 512, a report filed by a Portuguese bandeirante or frontiersman in 1753. Fawcett discovered a copy of this extraordinary text in the National Library of Rio de Janeiro. The author described stumbling upon a ruined, ancient city deep in the Mato Grosso region. He wrote of a great archway blackened by time, and beyond it, a magnificent street leading to a central plaza dominated by a towering statue of a man pointing north. He described exquisite hieroglyphs, multi-storied buildings, and even a silver mine, suggesting a level of wealth and architectural sophistication that mainstream science insisted was impossible for the Amazon. This account was not an isolated tale. Fawcett found echoes of it in other colonial records and in the persistent stories told by the indigenous communities he encountered on his mapping expeditions. While many explorers dismissed these accounts as mere myth, Fawcett listened with a different ear. He heard not fairy tales but fragmented history. Tribes like the Kalapalo and the Xingu spoke of places of the ancestors, stone cities that had been swallowed by the jungle long ago. They described men with white skin who had come from the east in the distant past, bringing knowledge and building great works before vanishing. For Fawcett, these stories weren't just corroborating evidence for Manuscript 512. They were the living memory of the civilization he sought. He began to theorize that this lost culture was the progenitor of all South American civilizations, a sophisticated society that had been decimated by European diseases long before permanent settlements were established, leaving only whispers behind. His theory, which he dubbed Z, was a direct challenge to the prevailing academic wisdom of his era. Anthropologists like Alfred Haddon and others argued that the Amazon's environment was simply too hostile and its soil too nutrient-poor to support the intensive agriculture required for a large, complex society. They viewed the jungle as a place of primal simplicity. Fawcett, however, the man who had actually walked its length and breadth, saw potential complexity. He postulated that this ancient culture possessed advanced knowledge of agriculture and engineering that we had since lost, allowing them to thrive where we assumed they could not. He wasn't searching for a city of gold, but for a city of knowledge, proof that human history in the Americas was far older and more magnificent than anyone had dared to believe. This intellectual framework gave his mission a profound sense of purpose. He wasn't just an adventurer, he was a revisionist historian on a solitary crusade to force the world to reconsider everything it thought it knew. Bolstered by his research and a near-religious conviction, Fawcett secured funding for his first dedicated expedition to find Z in 1921. This was no longer a government mapping mission. It was a targeted strike into the unknown, the culmination of over a decade of theorizing and planning. He assembled a sizable team, a mix of seasoned explorers and local laborers, and set out from the town of Cuiabá with enough supplies to last months. The sheer scale of his ambition was immediately met by the brutal reality of the Amazon. The terrain was even more treacherous than he remembered, a suffocating world of mud, thorns, and ceaseless, draining humidity. Progress was measured in agonizingly slow yards per day as they hacked their way through vine-choked undergrowth. Beyond the environment, the human threats were constant and terrifying. The expedition ventured into territories controlled by tribes who had never had a peaceful encounter with outsiders. The air was often pierced by the chilling sound of war horns, signaling they were being watched and not welcomed. On several occasions, they found the path ahead lined with sharpened stakes, a clear and deadly warning to turn back. they would awake to find human footprints circling their camp, a silent message that they were tolerated for the moment but not safe. Disease was an even more insidious enemy. The men were ravaged by fevers that left them shaking and delirious, by festering wounds that refused to heal in the damp air, and by parasites that sapped their strength. One by one, Fawcett's men began to falter, their bodies and spirits broken by the green hell. The expedition quickly became unsustainable. With his team disintegrating from sickness and fear, Fawcett made the difficult but calculated decision to send the majority of the party back. He pressed on with just two of his toughest companions, a skeleton crew that could move faster and attract less attention. It was in this pared-down state that Fawcett believed he found his most compelling evidence yet. He documented strange, ancient markings on rocks that seemed unlike any natural formation. He came across what he described in his journals as a great stone tower, weathered and covered in moss, standing in a clearing as if placed by some forgotten hand. Most significantly, he reported discovering the overgrown foundations of what appeared to be massive stone buildings, structures that spoke of a permanent, organized settlement, not a nomadic tribe. To the outside world, the 1921 expedition was a failure. He had not returned with photographs of gleaming cities or cartloads of artifacts. But for Fawcett himself, it was a resounding validation. The hardships he endured only reinforced his belief that something of immense value was hidden there, something worth protecting. The hostile tribes weren't just random aggressors. In his mind, they were the guardians of the secret, living in the shadow of the ruins and defending them from intruders. The stonework and foundations he glimpsed were not ambiguous, they were the proof he needed. He returned to England more certain than ever that Z was real, and that he was the only man with the knowledge, the endurance, and the sheer force of will to find it. The failure had only sharpened his obsession, setting the stage for the final, fateful journey that would seal his legend. Back in England, his mind was ablaze with a new, radical plan for the next attempt. He was convinced that the sheer size and commotion of his previous expedition had been its downfall. The large team, with its clattering equipment and chorus of complaints, had been like a bull in a china shop, impossible to miss, easily tracked, and inherently threatening to anyone they encountered. For his final, definitive search for Z, Fawcett decided on a strategy of minimalism and stealth. He would take only two companions, his 21-year-old son, Jack, and Jack's best friend, Rolly Rimmel. This was not a sentimental choice. In Fawcett's eyes, it was a tactical masterstroke. He was training his own successor, forging a small, dedicated unit bound by absolute loyalty and a shared, unwavering belief in the mission. Jack Fawcett was no pampered aristocrat. He was a tough, determined young man who had been rigorously conditioned by his father for this moment through years of brutal physical training, survival drills, and a deep immersion in the lore of Z. Rolly, while less obsessed, was a capable athlete and a trusted member of the inner circle. They were, Fawcett believed, the perfect team, agile, resilient, and utterly committed. The British public, however, saw something else entirely. The expedition captured the imagination of a nation still weary from the horrors of the First World War. Here was a story of classic British daring-do, a romantic quest into the unknown led by a heroic colonel and his handsome, courageous son. The newspapers couldn't get enough. They were portrayed as the ideal of Edwardian masculinity and exploration, their departure hyped into a sensational media event. Photographs of the trio in their rugged expedition gear were splashed across the front pages. Fawcett, ever the savvy self-promoter, knew how to work the crowd, giving interviews that carefully blended hard facts with tantalizing hints of ancient mysteries and vast, undiscovered riches. He secured funding from a consortium of London financiers and newspapers, including the generous backing of the North American Newspaper Alliance, which ensured his story would be wired back to an eager audience across the Atlantic. The group was celebrated at lavish farewell dinners, treated like celebrities embarking on a glorious adventure. This public adulation, however, masked a more complex and troubling reality. Behind the scenes, the scientific establishment was deeply skeptical. The Royal Geographical Society, which had sponsored his earlier, more conventional mapping missions, pointedly refused to fund this quest for a phantom city. Many of his former colleagues thought the old soldier had finally lost his grip, succumbing to jungle fever and fanciful delusions. There were also quiet concerns about the wisdom of taking two such young, inexperienced men on a journey from which seasoned explorers had not returned. But Fawcett would hear none of it. His certainty was now absolute, an unshakable faith that bordered on fanaticism. He had meticulously planned their route to avoid the areas that had caused so much trouble in 1921, believing he had deciphered a safer path to the same destination. He packed light, prioritizing precision instruments, ammunition for hunting, and gifts for tribes over bulky supplies. His final instructions to his family and backers were stark and ominous. If they did not hear from him after a certain period, they were to send no rescue party. He believed a large search effort would be futile and would only result in more unnecessary deaths. He was either coming back with the discovery of the century, or he was not coming back at all. The send-off from Liverpool in January of 1925 was a scene of tremendous optimism and public fanfare. Crowds gathered to wish the three explorers Godspeed as they boarded the ship to South America. They stood on the deck, waving, their faces a mixture of determination and excitement, the picture of confidence. Jack and Raleigh, in particular, embodied the youthful bravado of the enterprise, seeing it as the ultimate adventure. In his final dispatch to the North American Newspaper Alliance before plunging into the interior, Fawcett's words were brimming with a potent mix of caution and supreme confidence. He wrote of the dangers that lay ahead, but also of his unwavering conviction that he was on the verge of a world-altering find. He signed off not with a goodbye, but with a promise of monumental news to come. As they disappeared up the Rio Paraguay into the vastness of the Mato Grosso, the world waited, expecting to soon hear a triumphant cable announcing one of history's greatest archaeological discoveries. The silence that followed instead would become one of the most haunting mysteries of the 20th century. Their journey into the interior was a slow, deliberate retreat from the modern world. Traveling by steamer up the Rio Paraguay and then into the smaller, murkier tributaries, they watched the last traces of 20th century life fade away. The bustling ports gave way to isolated trading posts, and then to nothing but the endless green wall of the jungle. The three men were utterly alone with their mission, reliant on their own skills and the few hired guides who agreed to take them only so far before turning back, too fearful of the territories that lay ahead. Every mile traveled was a step deeper into a land that time had forgotten, a world governed by its own ancient and unforgiving rules. Their first major goal was the remote outpost of Cuiabá, a rough frontier town that represented the very last island of what they would recognize as civilization. It was here that Fawcett made his final preparations, purchasing pack animals and bargaining for last-minute supplies. The locals watched the trio with a mixture of curiosity and pity, recognizing the grim determination in Fawcett's eyes but seeing the youthful, almost naive optimism in the faces of Jack and Raleigh. To the seasoned frontiersmen of Cuiabá, this was not a glorious mission but a suicide plunge into a region they called the Green Hell, a place from which few returned sane and even fewer returned alive. After a few tense days of repacking and final checks, the expedition turned its back on the outpost and headed east into the vast, uncharted expanse of the Mato Grosso. The initial phase of the overland trek was grueling but manageable. They followed old trails used by bandeirantes and rubber tappers, paths that were faint and overgrown but still passable. The humidity was a physical weight, and the insects were a constant torment. Yet the team's spirits remained high. Jack and Raleigh, despite the hardships, were energized by the raw adventure of it all, their confidence buoyed by Fawcett's unwavering leadership. He was in his element, navigating by compass and sextant, taking meticulous notes on the geography and any unusual features they passed. He was convinced they were on the right path, following the clues he had pieced together from manuscript 512 and his own previous expedition. Progress, however, became agonizingly slow as the existing trails vanished, forcing them to hack their own path through dense undergrowth with machetes. Their pack animals, terrified by the strange scents and difficult terrain, became a liability. One horse, spooked by something unseen in the jungle, plunged into a deep bog and had to be put down after breaking its leg. This incident provided the name for the last place from which the world would ever hear from Percy Fawcett. In a small, fly-blown clearing, he marked the spot on his map as Dead Horse Camp. It was from this bleak and lonely campsite on May 29, 1925, that Fawcett sent his final dispatch back with a native guide who was returning to Cuiabá. The message was a masterclass in Fawcett's characteristic blend of stark realism and unshakable optimism. He detailed the immense difficulties they faced, the exhausting labor, the troublesome animals, the swarms of biting insects that made life miserable. He wrote of being constantly watched by unseen eyes, a feeling of pervasive surveillance that never lifted. Yet, interwoven with these hardships was a thread of thrilling promise. He reported that Jack was suffering from a minor leg wound but remained in good spirits, and that Raleigh was battling a fever but was recovering. Most importantly, he expressed his absolute conviction that they were on the verge of success. His closing words were not a farewell but a declaration of intent. He stated plainly that they were now leaving the horses behind and proceeding on foot, and that he expected to need several months to reach their objective and return. He expressly forbade anyone from mounting a rescue mission if they did not return on schedule, believing it would only lead to more tragedy. The note was signed with his customary confidence, a man not bidding goodbye but simply stating he would be out of touch for a while. The guide took the letter and disappeared back down the trail, leaving the three explorers alone at the edge of the true unknown. They turned away from Dead Horse Camp and walked into the deep jungle, their figures swallowed by the immense silent greenery. The world waited for the next triumphant message, but the wire from Cuiabá fell silent. The only thing that remained was the overwhelming quiet of the Amazon, keeping its secrets once again. The silence from the jungle was not immediately alarming. Fawcett had been clear that they would be out of contact for months, perhaps even a year or more. But as the seasons turned and no word arrived, a slow, creeping dread began to replace the initial public excitement. The first real attempt to piece together their final days began with the native guides who had accompanied them partway. These men, whose names are largely lost to history, provided the last independent eyewitness accounts of the Fawcett party alive and well. One guide, a man from the Bakari tribe, reported traveling with them for several weeks beyond Dead Horse Camp. He described their direction of travel as eastward toward the headwaters of the Xingu River, a region notorious even among local tribes for its isolation and the presence of groups hostile to outsiders. According to his account, the three Englishmen were in surprisingly good spirits despite the brutal conditions. Their supplies were holding, and Fawcett's legendary navigational skills seemed to keep them precisely on course. The guide eventually turned back at a specific river, a boundary his people considered the edge of the safe world. He watched them continue on, three small figures swallowed by the immense greenery, and that was the last anyone from the outside world saw of them. This account aligns with the most persistent and widely accepted theory, one that Fawcett himself had long feared and even predicted: a violent encounter with a local tribe. The area they were entering was the known territory of the Kalapalo people, a formidable group with a well-deserved reputation for defending their lands. The Kalapalo themselves have told versions of a story for generations that seems to match the time frame of the disappearance. In their oral history, they speak of 3 outsiders, 2 young men and an older leader, passing through their territory. Relations, according to these accounts, were initially tense but not immediately hostile. The Kalapalo warned the group not to travel further, to turn back, stating that the next tribe along the river, the Suya, were dangerous and would certainly kill them. Fawcett, driven by an obsession that had now blinded him to pragmatic counsel, reportedly refused to heed these warnings. He may have viewed them not as a genuine threat assessment, but as a superstitious attempt to guard the secret of Z. This refusal could have been seen as a grave insult or a declaration of hostile intent. Some Kalapalo stories suggest a final, tragic misunderstanding occurred. One version tells that the expedition's dog, which had followed them from a previous village, barked at a Kalapalo child. Fawcett, perhaps trying to be friendly, shot the dog. To the Kalapalo, this act of killing a loyal animal for a minor transgression may have been inexplicable and frightening, branding the foreigners as unpredictable and dangerous men who needed to be eliminated for the safety of the village. The stories then say the men were killed and their bodies disposed of in a river. Other theories, while less supported by first-hand accounts, have persisted with their own compelling logic. Some posited that the entire party simply succumbed to the jungle itself, to starvation after their supplies ran out, or to a common fate like drowning while trying to cross a swollen river during the rainy season. Disease was another ever-present reaper. A bout of malaria or dysentery could have incapacitated and then killed all 3 within a matter of days, leaving no trace for anyone to find. There was even a romantic, if unlikely, theory that Fawcett did find his city and chose to live out his days there in spiritual enlightenment, having forsaken the modern world. This idea was fueled by sporadic, fantastical reports over the decades of a tall, white, aging chieftain living among a remote tribe, but these stories were never substantiated. The truth is, the Amazon is a master of making things vanish. It is a place of rapid decay and relentless growth, where a body can be consumed by insects and animals in hours, and where a campsite can be reclaimed by the jungle in a matter of days. The fate of Percy Fawcett, Jack, and Raleigh Rimmel is likely a simple, brutal story lost to this efficient entropy. The most probable scenario is that they met a sudden end, either by violence or accident, and the jungle did what it has done for millennia. It absorbed them completely, leaving behind only a mystery for the world to unravel. For 2 years, the world held its breath, clinging to Fawcett's final, stern instruction: send no rescue party. But by 1927, with no word and no sign, that fragile hope shattered. The silence from the Amazon became a roar of anxiety, and the first frantic attempts to find them began. What started as a trickle of concern soon swelled into a flood of speculation and a series of ill-fated expeditions that would only deepen the mystery. The vanishing of Percy Fawcett was no longer just a news story. It was evolving into an international obsession, a real-life adventure tale with a terrifyingly blank final chapter. The first organized search was launched in 1928, financed by a group of American newspapers and led by a journalist and explorer named George Dyott. His mission was to retrace Fawcett's intended route, following the trail of rumors and the few concrete clues they had, starting from the grimly named Dead Horse Camp. Dyott's expedition was a stark contrast to Fawcett's minimalist approach. It was a large, well-equipped affair, but it quickly learned that numbers were no match for the jungle's indifference. The team found Dead Horse Camp, and there, amidst the rusting cans and the skeletal remains of the pack animal, they discovered what they believed to be a crucial clue: Fawcett's personal compass lodged in the mud. To Dyott, this was a terrifying sign. For a man of Fawcett's meticulous discipline and legendary navigational skill, to abandon his compass suggested a moment of sheer panic or utter catastrophe. Pushing deeper, Dyott and his men made contact with the Kalapalo tribe, the same group whose warnings Fawcett had reportedly ignored years before. The stories the Kalapalo told Dyott would form the bedrock of the most enduring theory about the expedition's fate. Through interpreters, the tribesmen recounted the arrival of the three white men. They described the older leader as stern and refusing to heed their advice to turn back. They spoke of a final, tragic night. The Kalapalo claimed that the foreigners had camped on the other side of a river from their village, and during the night they saw their campfires extinguish one by one, never to be relit. In the morning, the men were gone. The Kalapalo's conclusion was stark and simple. They had been killed for their arrogance and their refusal to listen, likely by the more aggressive Suya tribe further downriver. As proof, they presented Dyot with a silver identity disc that had belonged to Jack Fawcett and a small trunk filled with some of the group's personal effects. Dyot returned to civilization convinced he had solved the mystery. His reports, splashed across front pages worldwide, presented a seemingly closed case. Fawcett had been killed by hostile Indians. For a public desperate for answers, however grim, this provided a kind of closure, but the story was far from over. Dyot's evidence was entirely circumstantial. He had no bodies, no forensic proof, and he was relying on translated stories that could have been misunderstood, embellished, or even deliberately misleading. Tribes in the Amazon were well aware of the power of the outside world, and sometimes told visitors what they thought they wanted to hear to make them go away. The Kalapalo, for instance, may have blamed a rival tribe to deflect blame from themselves or to simply end the questioning. Dyot's solution didn't satisfy everyone. In fact, it only served to pour gasoline on the public's fascination, opening up a new world of possibilities and doubts. The late 1920s saw the Fawcett mystery explode into a global phenomenon, a captivating blend of true crime, adventure, and ghost story that dominated headlines. The world was ripe for such a tale. In the uneasy peace following the First World War, people craved stories of individual heroism and grand quests. The notion of a famous British colonel and his handsome son disappearing in a search for El Dorado was irresistible fodder for newspapers and pulp magazines. It had all the elements of a classic narrative: a noble goal, a larger-than-life hero, a treacherous landscape, and an ambiguous ending that allowed everyone to imagine their own conclusion. Fawcett wasn't just missing, he became a blank canvas onto which the world projected its own fears, fantasies, and romantic ideals. This public frenzy had a dangerous consequence. It inspired a wave of amateur adventurers to launch their own rescue missions, most of them hopelessly unprepared for the reality that had consumed even a professional like Fawcett. These fortune hunters and thrill seekers, dubbed Fawcett freaks by the press, poured into the Mato Grosso, often meeting the very fate they sought to investigate. Some vanished without a trace themselves. Others returned with wild, unverifiable tales of finding a white chieftain who was Jack Fawcett, or of a tribe guarding a secret city of gold, or of ancient inscriptions that held the key to the mystery. Each new rumor, no matter how outlandish, was devoured by a hungry public and a sensationalist press, further blurring the line between fact and fiction. The legend of Percy Fawcett was growing larger than the man himself, transforming a tragic disappearance into an enduring myth that the jungle seemed determined to keep secret. While George Dyot's account of a violent end seemed to offer a clear answer, the mystery was far too compelling to be settled so easily. The absence of any physical evidence left the door wide open for a century of speculation, with theories ranging from the tragically plausible to the wildly fantastical. The most widely accepted explanation remains that the expedition met a grim fate at the hands of one of the many indigenous groups in the region. The Amazon was not an empty wilderness. It was a carefully managed network of territories, and the Fawcett party were intruders moving through lands defended by people who had every reason to be hostile. Beyond the Kalapalo stories, other tribes in the area, like the Kayapo or the Zavante, were known for their fierce resistance to outsiders. An attack could have been swift and final, with the jungle quickly reclaiming any evidence. This theory aligns with Fawcett's own journals, which frequently noted the palpable tension of being watched and the clear warnings to turn back. Yet, the jungle itself was a formidable killer, independent of any human conflict. Disease was a constant, lurking threat that required no violent encounter. A severe bout of malaria or yellow fever could have incapacitated all three men within days, leaving them too weak to hunt or travel. Parasitic infections like beriberi or leishmaniasis would have slowly sapped their strength, leading to a miserable and gradual decline. Starvation was another very real possibility if their supplies were lost or depleted and game proved scarce. Even a simple accident like a fall from a cliff or a drowning in a treacherous river could have doomed the entire mission. If one man was injured, the others would have stayed to help, creating a vulnerable stationary target for all the other dangers of the rainforest. In this view, the fate of the Fawcett expedition was not a dramatic confrontation but a slow, quiet surrender to an environment that is utterly indifferent to human life. The most romantic and enduring alternative theory suggests that Fawcett did not die at all, but rather achieved a different kind of goal. Perhaps he found not a city of stone, but a people living in a way he found more spiritually pure than his own industrial society. This idea posits that Fawcett, the theosophist who believed in ancient wisdom, chose to abandon the modern world and assimilate into a remote tribe. Over the decades, this notion was fueled by numerous reported sightings. In the 1930s, a Swiss trapper named Stefan Ratten claimed to have met a white chieftain who was the spitting image of an older Fawcett living among the Machiparo tribe. Decades later, in the 1960s, the Brazilian explorer Orlando Vilas Boas was told a story by the Kalapalo about an old white man who had lived with them for many years before eventually dying of natural causes. While these stories captured the public's imagination, they were never substantiated with any proof. They speak less to the reality of Fawcett's fate and more to the powerful desire for a less tragic, more enlightened ending for the legendary explorer. The mystery took an even stranger turn in the 1950s with the sensational claims of a German-Brazilian adventurer named Karl Brugger. He met a tribesman named Tatanka Nara from the Amazon who claimed to be the son of Jack Fawcett. According to this incredible story, Percy and Jack had indeed found their city, a place called Akaka, and had integrated into its society. Jack had married a local woman and Tatanka Nara was their son. Brugger wrote a best-selling book, The Chronicle of Akaka, based on these claims. For a time, it revitalized the mythos of a hidden civilization. However, the story completely unraveled upon investigation. Tatanka Nara was later identified as a former German sailor named Gunther Hawk, a notorious hoaxer who had fabricated his entire identity and was eventually implicated in the deaths of several people who went with him to search for the non-existent Akaka. This episode serves as a stark warning about how easily the Fawcett legend could be manipulated and how the desire to believe could override basic skepticism. Ultimately, the sheer number of theories, from the mundane to the miraculous, reveals more about us than it does about Percy Fawcett. His disappearance became a Rorschach test onto which people projected their own fears, fantasies, and worldview. For some, it was a straightforward cautionary tale about hubris and the dangers of the unknown. For others, it was a romantic saga of a man who found the enlightenment he sought. For the pragmatic, it was a tragic accident. The truth is likely the simplest and most brutal theory, that the trio fell victim to the very real and documented perils that Fawcett himself had written about for years. The Amazon is a place that specializes in making things vanish without a trace. Their story ended not with a revelation, but with the same immense silence that had always defined the jungle they sought to conquer. The unanswered question of their fate proved to be more powerful than any discovery could have been. A successful return with artifacts might have made a few headlines before fading into academic journals, but the absolute, haunting silence from the jungle created a vacuum that the world rushed to fill with myth. Percy Fawcett ceased to be merely a missing explorer and was reborn as a permanent icon of the unknown, a symbol of the ultimate price of obsession. This transformation began almost immediately, as the very newspapers that had funded his quest now had an endless source of sensational copy. The story had everything: a noble family man, a dashing young heir, a loyal friend, a glittering prize, and a terrifyingly blank ending. It was a ready-made Gothic novel set in the heart of the 20th century, and the public could not get enough. This global fascination ignited a bizarre and often tragic secondary industry, the search for the searchers. For decades after 1925, a steady stream of amateur adventurers, eccentric millionaires, and outright charlatans plunged into the Amazon, convinced they could succeed where so many had vanished. These pilgrims were dubbed Fawcett freaks, and their missions were often fueled more by romantic delusion than careful planning. Many met grim fates that eerily mirrored the one they sought to explain. In 1928, a young American adventurer named Albert de Winton headed into the jungle and was never seen again. A Russian journalist named Pavel Ponomarev vanished in the same region in 1932. The Brazilian jungle had become a siren call for the desperate and the deluded, and it did not discriminate. The Fawcett legend was literally claiming lives, adding a grim new layer to its legacy and proving the Colonel's own grim prophecy that a rescue mission would be a death sentence. The literary world quickly seized upon the story, cementing Fawcett's legendary status in the public imagination. In 1933, the popular author Arthur Conan Doyle, a personal acquaintance of Fawcett's and a fellow spiritualist, had already provided a fictional template with his novel The Lost World, featuring a character based on the explorer. But it was non-fiction accounts that truly fed the mystery. Books like Exploration Fawcett, compiled from his own journals and published by his surviving son Brian, offered a thrilling, first-hand account that made readers feel they were right beside him, making the vanishing all the more poignant. Decades later, the story found its definitive chronicler in David Grann, whose meticulously researched 1909 bestseller The Lost City of Z reintroduced the tale to a new generation, masterfully weaving together Fawcett's biography with Grann's own quest to understand his obsession. This book itself became a cultural touchstone, later adapted into a major motion picture, ensuring the legend's endurance into the 21st century. Beyond books and films, Fawcett's Disappearance had a paradoxical and profound impact on the very field of Amazonian archaeology he sought to revolutionize. For most of his life, his theories were dismissed as the fantasies of a madman. The academic consensus, known as the empty forest hypothesis, insisted the rainforest was too environmentally poor to have ever supported large-scale, complex societies. But the relentless attention brought by his mystery and the continued expeditions it inspired slowly began to chip away at this orthodoxy. Researchers were forced to keep looking, and with new technology like satellite imagery and LiDAR, they began to see what Fawcett had only felt, the ghostly outlines of a different past. They discovered evidence of vast earthworks, sophisticated road systems, and complex settlements that had been completely invisible from the ground. Fawcett, it turned out, wasn't entirely wrong. He was just looking for the wrong thing. He envisioned a stone city like those of the Incas or Maya, but the advanced civilizations of the Amazon built with wood and earth, materials that decayed and were swallowed by the jungle within generations. His Lost City of Z was a mirage, but the fundamental concept of a significant, lost prehistoric culture in the Amazon was not. In a final, incredible twist of fate, the man once ridiculed by science was posthumously vindicated by it, his wildest theories validated in ways he could never have imagined. Ultimately, the true legacy of Percy Fawcett is not a place on a map, but an idea. He represents the eternal human drive to look beyond the horizon, to believe that the greatest secrets are still waiting to be found. His story is a permanent reminder that our maps, both literal and metaphorical, are never truly complete. The blank spaces may have been filled in with satellite imagery, but the mysteries of human history, courage, and obsession remain as deep and vast as the Amazon itself. He became immortal not because he found what he was looking for, but because he was willing to be lost in the search. Decades after the last dispatch from Dead Horse Camp faded into silence, the most compelling and haunting account of the expedition's final hours would come from the very people who had watched them walk into the unknown. The Kalapalo tribe, whose territory encompassed the region Fawcett it was determined to enter, preserved an oral history that was passed down through generations. It wasn't until anthropologists like Ellen Basso and others began working closely with the Kalapalo in the 1950s and 60s that this story was meticulously documented and shared with the outside world, offering a perspective that was both chilling and deeply human. According to the Kalapalo elders, 3 white men did indeed arrive at their village. They were described in precise detail that matched the Fawcett party: an older, stern-faced leader and 2 younger companions, one of whom was notably handsome. The initial reception was not overtly hostile but was fraught with a tense, watchful caution. The Kalapalo, like all tribes in the region, had learned to be deeply wary of outsiders whose previous visits had often brought violence and disease. They observed the foreigners closely, noting their weak physical state, their bodies thin and ravaged by the journey, their spirits seemingly worn down by the relentless jungle. The Kalapalo offered them food, primarily fish, which the white men refused to eat. This refusal was not seen as a simple dietary preference. In the social codes of the Xingu tribes, sharing food is a fundamental act of peace and trust. To reject offered sustenance is a profound insult, a clear signal of distrust and potential ill intent. The Kalapalo account then describes a pivotal moment that escalated the situation toward tragedy. They warned the explorers not to travel further east, explaining that the next tribe along the river, the Suya, were aggressive and would certainly kill them. They urged the party to turn back and even offered to guide them to safety. Fawcett, his mind singularly focused on his goal and perhaps viewing the warning as a superstitious attempt to deter him from his prize, stubbornly refused. His unwavering determination, the very quality that had brought him so far, now became a fatal flaw. From the Kalapalo perspective, this refusal to heed their expert advice was not just foolish. It was a dangerous arrogance that could provoke a conflict with the Suya, potentially drawing their own village into a wider war. The presence of these unpredictable, disrespectful outsiders was becoming a tangible threat to their entire community's safety. The stories then diverge on the specific trigger for the violence. One persistent version tells of the expedition's dog, which had followed them from a previous village. The animal allegedly barked aggressively at a Kalapalo child, causing fear and alarm. In response, Fawcett is said to have shot and killed the dog. If true, this act would have been utterly mystifying and terrifying to the Kalapalo. To kill a loyal animal companion for a minor transgression demonstrated a shocking and unpredictable capacity for violence, confirming their deepest fears about these strangers. Another version simply states that the elders, after much discussion, concluded the men were too dangerous to allow to leave and potentially ally with their enemies. The Kalapalo oral history concludes with the same stark outcome. The 3 men were killed at a place called Kuluin near the river, and their bodies were disposed of in the water. This testimony seems to provide a definitive, first-hand solution to the mystery. However, when archaeologists and researchers attempted to corroborate the story with physical evidence, the picture became much less clear. In the 1990s, a Brazilian anthropologist guided by Kalapalo elders to the purported site discovered a collection of early 20th century artifacts, a knife, buttons, and beads that could plausibly have belonged to the Fawcett party. Yet these items were trade goods, common currency for explorers, and their presence only confirms that someone was there, not necessarily what happened to them. More significantly, efforts to find human remains in the area have consistently failed. The Kalapalo said the bodies were put in the river, which would have scattered the bones or allowed them to be consumed by wildlife, leaving no trace for forensics to examine. This lack of concrete proof has led some researchers to propose an alternative interpretation of the Kalapalo story. It's possible the account is a synthesis of actual events and tribal folklore that evolved over time. The Kalapalo, who became famous as the tribe that killed Fawcett, may have incorporated a well-known disappearance into their own historical narrative, perhaps to explain a conflict with another group or to deter future intruders by presenting themselves as powerful and not to be trifled with. Their detailed description could have been pieced together from descriptions provided by later search parties like Diots, who showed them photographs and asked leading questions. The story, in this light, becomes not a literal confession but a powerful cultural narrative that serves a specific purpose for the Kalapalo people themselves. Whether a factual account or a layered legend, the Kalapalo testimony remains the most poignant and credible window into the expedition's likely end, not in a dramatic battle, but in a tragic collision of two utterly different worlds that failed to understand each other. For generations, the academic world had dismissed Percy Fawcett as a deluded romantic, a man chasing a phantom born from jungle fever and flawed 16th-century manuscripts. The prevailing theory, known as the pristine myth, insisted the Amazon was a counterfeit paradise, its soil too thin and nutrient-poor to ever have supported the kind of large, complex, sedentary societies that Fawcett dreamed of finding. He was ridiculed for imagining stone cities in a world of rot and decay. But in a stunning reversal of fortune, modern science has begun to unveil a truth that is, in many ways, more incredible than Fawcett's own vision. The jungle, it turns out, was not a pristine wilderness but a carefully managed garden, and the evidence of lost civilizations wasn't hidden in plain sight, it was hidden beneath it. The key to this paradigm shift wasn't a lone explorer with a machete, but a revolutionary technology viewing the forest from the heavens, LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging. Imagine being able to digitally strip away every single leaf, vine, and tree from an entire landscape, revealing the naked earth beneath. That is precisely what LiDAR does. Mounted on aircraft, it fires millions of laser pulses at the ground, measuring their return time to create an exquisitely detailed, three-dimensional map of the forest floor. When archaeologists first began using this technology over the Amazon, the results were nothing short of breathtaking. The seemingly random, rolling hills of the rainforest were suddenly revealed to be something else entirely: vast geometric earthworks, enormous ceremonial platforms, and complex networks of roads and causeways that had been completely invisible for centuries. One of the most significant discoveries has been in the region of the upper Xingu River, not far from where Fawcett was last seen. LiDAR surveys and subsequent ground research have revealed a sprawling, interconnected network of towns and villages, a kind of prehistoric urban sprawl dating back over 1,000 years. These weren't the dense, stone-built cities of the Maya that Fawcett envisioned. Instead, they were sophisticated garden cities with large central plazas, defensive ditches and palisades, and radiating roads that connected satellite communities in a vast social and economic web. The inhabitants, ancestors of the peoples living in the Xingu today, were master landscape engineers. They practiced a form of agroforestry, cultivating entire groves of valuable trees like palm and Brazil nut, and enriching the naturally poor soil by creating terra preta, rich, fertile, dark earth, through a deliberate process of adding charcoal, pottery shards, and organic waste. This sustainable practice allowed them to support populations far larger than anyone thought possible. Further west, in the Brazilian state of Acre, researchers have uncovered hundreds of enormous geometric geoglyphs, perfect circles, squares, and octagons carved into the earth, some spanning over 300 meters across. These structures, dating back 2,000 years, were not villages but likely had ceremonial or astronomical purposes. Their scale and precision rival the famous Nazca lines of Peru and speak of a highly organized society capable of mobilizing labor for large-scale projects that required sophisticated mathematical and engineering knowledge. Similar discoveries of mound complexes, river management systems, and evidence of large-scale fish farming are being reported from Bolivia to the mouth of the Amazon itself. The picture that is emerging is not of a few isolated chiefdoms, but of a continent-wide pattern of development, a mosaic of complex societies that thrived for millennia before European diseases swept through the continent in waves, decimating up to 95% of the population and allowing the jungle to reclaim their works in a matter of generations. This is the profound and heartbreaking irony of Fawcett's quest. He was fundamentally right in his core belief that a significant, advanced civilization had once existed in the Amazon, but he was looking for the wrong kind of evidence. He sought Z in the form of monolithic stone ruins, the classic trappings of empire that he knew from the Old World. The real lost cities of the Amazon were built of wood, earth, and living plants, materials that returned to the forest with startling speed once their stewards were gone. The civilization he sought wasn't lost in space, it was lost in time, its greatest monuments not towering pyramids but the very composition of the forest itself, an enduring landscape shaped by human hands. Percy Fawcett's true legacy is not a map to a single city, but a question that forced science to look deeper, proving that sometimes the most powerful truth is not the one we find, but the one that changes how we see everything. But if Fawcett wasn't searching for mere legend, what tangible evidence has modern archaeology actually uncovered? The answer lies in a remarkable place known as Curucugu, a sprawling archaeological complex located in Brazil's Xingu region, shockingly close to the area where Fawcett was last reported. Discovered and studied in depth by archaeologists like Michael Heckenberger, who began working with the Curucuro people, the direct descendants of the site's builders, Curucugu isn't a single, isolated city of stone. Instead, it's the remnants of a vast, interconnected network of settlements that thrived between roughly 1,500 years ago. This discovery didn't just offer clues, it provided a revolutionary blueprint for understanding what a sophisticated Amazonian civilization truly looked like, and in doing so, it forced a dramatic re-evaluation of Fawcett's entire quest. The settlements of the Curucugu complex were not the towering granite metropolises of Fawcett's imagination, but they were nonetheless feats of extraordinary engineering and social organization. Imagine not just a village, but a carefully planned urban landscape. Archaeologists found evidence of large circular plazas, wide, straight roads that ran for miles connecting satellite communities, strategic bridges spanning rivers, and even sophisticated moats and palisades for defense. These were not scattered tribes, but a coordinated cluster of garden cities, supporting a population that some estimates place in the tens of thousands. The inhabitants were master manipulators of their environment. They practiced intensive agriculture, cultivating maize, manioc, and other crops in enriched soils, and they managed the surrounding forest to provide a sustainable supply of food and resources. This was a civilization built in harmony with the jungle, not in opposition to it, constructing its grandeur from earth and wood rather than quarried stone. So, was Fawcett right? The answer is a fascinating and deeply nuanced yes and no. He was spectacularly wrong about the aesthetic. He searched for something that looked like the ruins of ancient Rome or Greece, with grand columns and carved monuments. The reality of Curucugu was subtler, its majesty expressed in landscape architecture and social complexity, visible only from an aerial perspective or through the patient work of a trowel. But on the fundamental premise of his life's work, Percy Fawcett has been overwhelmingly vindicated. He believed the Amazon was not a pristine wilderness but the cradle of a significant advanced culture. He was convinced it could support large, sedentary populations through advanced agricultural techniques. He theorized that the indigenous peoples of his day were the inheritors of this lost world. On every single one of these core, heretical ideas, modern science has proven him correct. The significance of Curucugu and other sites like it extends far beyond validating one explorer's obsession. It completely shatters the long-held, empty forest paradigm that dominated scientific thought for a century. We now understand that the Amazon basin was not a near-empty landscape of small, nomadic bands, but a region teeming with complex societies before European contact. The cataclysmic arrival of old-world diseases like smallpox and measles likely wiped out over 90% of this population in a series of horrific pandemics that swept through the river networks ahead of the explorers themselves. The untouched jungle that Europeans encountered was in fact a recently abandoned garden, a vast territory of managed forest and fertile earth that was quickly being reclaimed by nature. The great lost city Fawcett sought had, in a sense, been all around him. Its people were largely gone, but the shape of their world was still etched into the very soil. He was walking through the ghost of a civilization, searching for its bones while standing on its grave. This revolutionary shift in understanding did not come from a daring adventurer hacking through the undergrowth, but from a quiet, technological marvel orbiting high above the earth. For decades, the dense canopy of the Amazon was the ultimate shield, hiding its secrets from prying eyes on the ground. But the development of advanced satellite technology and a sophisticated process called LiDAR finally gave scientists the key to see through that green veil. LiDAR, which stands for light detection and ranging, works by mounting a laser scanner on an aircraft and flying it over a targeted area. The system fires millions of laser pulses down at the forest. Most hit the leaves and branches at the top of the canopy, but a significant number penetrate through small gaps all the way to the forest floor. By meticulously measuring the time it takes for each pulse to bounce back, a powerful computer can then strip away the digital image of every single tree, effectively rendering the entire jungle invisible. What remains is a breathtakingly detailed, three-dimensional map of the naked earth beneath, revealing every ditch, mound, and human-made alteration invisible to the naked eye for centuries. The images that began to emerge from these surveys were nothing short of revolutionary, completely overturning a century of academic dogma. Where traditional archaeologists had seen only untouched wilderness, the LiDAR maps revealed the ghostly, geometric imprint of a vast, forgotten world. In region after region, the technology uncovered sprawling networks of wide, straight roads connecting large settlements. It showed enormous ceremonial plazas, intricate systems of defensive ditches and moats, and evidence of sophisticated water management with canals and reservoirs. The scale was staggering. In the upper Xingu Basin, the very area Fawcett had been determined to explore, researchers discovered a connected network of at least 19 large garden cities, each with its own central plaza and radiating roads, all linked together like a prehistoric version of a metropolitan area. These were not the random villages of simple tribes, but the planned infrastructure of a complex society capable of organizing labor on a massive scale. Perhaps the most stunning discoveries have been the enormous geoglyphs found in the Brazilian state of Acre. From the ground, these are simply shallow ditches and raised embankments, easily mistaken for natural features. But from the air, with the vegetation digitally removed, their true forms are revealed. Perfect circles, squares, and octagons carved into the earth, some over 300 meters across. These structures, dating back over 2,000 years, were not villages but likely served ceremonial or astronomical purposes, their precision implying a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and engineering. The sheer number of them, hundreds, have been identified, points to a populous and highly organized culture that flourished for millennia. This was the kind of evidence Fawcett had dreamed of finding, but it was written in earth, not stone, and it required a 21st century lens to finally read it. These technological revelations have done more than just solve an archaeological puzzle. They have performed a profound act of historical justice for Percy Fawcett. The man who was ridiculed by the scientific establishment of his day as a deluded dreamer has been posthumously vindicated. His core theory that the Amazon rainforest was once home to a large, sophisticated civilization has been proven correct. The reality was simply different from what he had pictured. He envisioned a single, monolithic stone city like those of the Incas, a place he could walk into and touch. The truth, as revealed by satellite and LiDAR, is far more fascinating and complex. It was not one lost city of Z, but a lost continent of Z, a vast, interconnected tapestry of civilizations that managed the rainforest itself as a kind of living garden. They transformed the soil, cultivated entire forests of useful trees, and built their monuments not to tower over the jungle, but to work in harmony with it. Fawcett was right about the civilization, but wrong about its architecture. He was searching for skeletons when he was actually walking through its still beating heart. To truly grasp the unyielding drive that propelled Percy Fawcett into the green abyss again and again, we must look beyond the map and compass and into the mind of the man himself. Fawcett was a fascinating paradox, a character seemingly pulled from two entirely different stories. On one hand, he was the ultimate pragmatist, a disciplined military officer, a master surveyor who trusted empirical data and precise measurement above all else. This was the man who could navigate by the stars, calculate provisions to the ounce, and endure physical hardships that would break most people. Yet, coexisting within him was a profound mysticism, a man deeply immersed in the spiritualist and theosophical movements of his era, who believed wholeheartedly in ancient wisdom and hidden truths accessible only to those with the right kind of vision. It was the fierce and ultimately unresolved tension between these two sides of his personality, the rational scientist and the romantic occultist, that forged the engine of his obsession. His involvement with spiritualism wasn't a casual hobby, it was a core component of his worldview. Theosophy, popularized by figures like Madame Blavatsky, proposed that all world religions shared a common origin in a single, ancient, and universal wisdom tradition. For a man like Fawcett, spending years in remote corners of the world, this idea was incredibly potent. It suggested that the indigenous stories he heard in the Amazon weren't mere superstitions, but were instead fragmented echoes of this primordial truth. His infamous stone idol wasn't just a curious artifact to him, it was a tangible key. His decision to have it analyzed by a psychometrist, a person who claimed to psychically read an object's history, was entirely in character. When the psychometrist delivered a vivid vision of a mountainous kingdom with towering temples and a sophisticated people, Fawcett didn't dismiss it as fantasy. He filed it away as corroborating evidence, a data point from a different kind of science that he believed was just as valid. This mystical framework provided him with an unshakable faith that acted as an emotional and psychological shield. When the Royal Geographical Society refused to fund his search for Z, he didn't see it as a reasoned rejection by skeptical academics. He interpreted it as the short-sightedness of the establishment, a group too entrenched in their own rigid paradigms to recognize a higher truth. When his own companions on earlier expeditions expressed doubt or fear, he viewed it as a failure of their spirit, a lack of the necessary conviction. His belief system effectively insulated him from all counter-arguments. Every obstacle, from hostile tribes to diseased rivers, could be reinterpreted not as a warning, but as a test of his resolve, a final guardian protecting the secret. This is the hallmark of a true believer. Adversity doesn't weaken their faith, it purifies and strengthens it. We also cannot overlook the powerful psychological impact of his era. Fawcett was a man of the British Empire at its zenith, raised on a steady diet of Victorian ideals about masculine courage, national superiority, and the moral imperative to explore and conquer the blank spaces of the world. This cultural conditioning provided a ready-made narrative for his quest. He was the heroic white explorer penetrating the dark, savage unknown to bring back enlightenment. Furthermore, he came of age during the golden age of exploration, a time when figures like Stanley and Livingstone were global celebrities. The desire for that kind of immortal fame, to have his name etched alongside history's greatest discoverers, was undoubtedly a powerful motivator. He wasn't just searching for a city, he was searching for his legacy. Yet, to attribute his obsession solely to ego or spiritual delusion would be a grave oversimplification. There was a deep, almost paternalistic thread of romance in his motivation. He wasn't seeking to plunder Z for gold to bring home. He spoke of it as a place of profound knowledge and peace. In his writings, he expressed a genuine disdain for the modern industrial world, which he saw as corrupt and spiritually empty. He believed that by finding this lost civilization, he might retrieve some of its ancient wisdom and offer it to a world he felt was desperately in need of it. He wasn't just running toward something, he was also running away from the modernity he disdained. The jungle, for all its horrors, represented a purer, more authentic world, and Z was its ultimate expression. This complex psychological profile, the rationalist mystic, the fame-seeking idealist, the disillusioned romantic, created a perfect storm of obsession. It made him utterly resistant to pragmatic concerns. The safety of his son, Jack, and friend, Rolly Rimmel, became secondary to the grandeur of the goal. In his final letters, he expressed more concern about their commitment to the mission's spiritual purity than their physical preparedness. He had so completely fused his identity with the pursuit of Z that turning back was not merely a failure of the expedition, but a failure of his entire being. He could not conceive of a world in which Z did not exist, because to do so would mean that the central, driving force of his life for over 2 decades had been a lie. And that was a psychological void he simply could not face, so he walked forward into the waiting silence, propelled by a conviction that was, in equal measures, his greatest strength and his most tragic flaw. For Nina Fawcett, the silence from the jungle was not an ending but a prolonged, agonizing state of suspension. She had been her husband's most steadfast believer, his anchor in the outside world and the keeper of his dream. While the public's fascination eventually waned, turning her family's tragedy into a sensationalized mystery, Nina's private vigil was a matter of unwavering faith. She clung to her husband's final, stern instruction, "Send no rescue." For years, she interpreted this not as a premonition of doom, but as a sign of his supreme confidence. She truly believed he would emerge from the green curtain one day, perhaps years later, with the discovery that would silence all his critics. Her home became a shrine to this hope, filled with his maps, his meticulously typed reports, and the ever-present expectation of a telegram announcing his triumphant return. She managed the small income from his writings and the sporadic royalties, defending his reputation against detractors who labeled him a madman, all while raising their youngest son, Brian, largely alone. Her life became a testament to a love story interrupted, defined by a hope that refused to be extinguished by the passage of time or the grim reports from failed search parties. The burden of this legacy fell heavily on Brian Fawcett, who was just a boy when his father and brother vanished. He grew up in the long shadow of their absence, his childhood dominated by a famous missing father and an adored older brother who had become a permanent, ghostly figure of adventure. While his mother held onto the hope of their physical return, Brian was tasked with a different kind of guardianship, preserving and defending their story. As he reached adulthood, he became the family's reluctant archivist and public spokesperson, the sole voice for a saga he had not chosen. He sifted through the mountains of his father's papers, his brother's youthful diaries, and the endless correspondence from cranks and would-be rescuers. His relationship with his father's quest was profoundly complex. He loved and admired the man, but he was also a pragmatist who understood the immense human cost of such a consuming obsession. He witnessed firsthand the toll it took on his mother, watching her wait for a knock on the door that never came. While he honored the explorer's spirit, he did not inherit the fatal obsession. His journey was one of making peace with the mystery, not solving it. This peace was hard-won, forged in the fires of countless intrusions. The family was haunted not just by loss, but by the living specter of the legend itself. They were besieged by a parade of charlatans, each with a new clue or a sensational story designed to extract money or fame. There were psychics who claimed to have visions of the lost party living as white gods, fortune hunters promising to find them for a share of the non-existent treasure, and even imposters who boldly claimed to be Jack Fawcett returned from the jungle. Each new claim forced the family to relive the trauma, to have their private grief become public spectacle all over again. Brian, in particular, had to develop a thick skin and a sharp eye for deception, becoming the gatekeeper who protected his family's memory from the corrosive effects of fantasy and exploitation. He walked a difficult line, wanting to keep his father's memory alive for its genuine historical value, while desperately trying to shield his mother from the endless cycle of false hope and subsequent disappointment. The eventual passing of Nina Fawcett brought a painful form of closure. She had waited for over a decade, her hope enduring long after the rest of the world had accepted the truth. Her death meant the end of the immediate daily expectation of return. It allowed Brian, now the last remaining guardian of the story, to finally consolidate his father's legacy on his own terms. His great contribution was the publication of his father's journals in 1953 under the title Exploration Fawcett. This book was not just a posthumous memoir, it was an act of filial devotion and historical preservation. By presenting his father's story in his father's own words, Brian allowed the world to see the man as he saw himself, not as a deluded fool, but as a courageous, complex visionary. The book became a classic of exploration literature, ensuring that Percy Fawcett would be remembered for his contributions and his character, not just for his mysterious end. In doing so, Brian achieved what his father never could. He brought a measure of order and understanding to the chaos of the unknown, finally giving his family a legacy they could control and be proud of, a story of courage rather than just a cautionary tale about a vanishing. The first organized search, launched in 1928, was a direct response to the growing public anxiety. Financed by a consortium of American newspapers and led by explorer George Dyott, the mission aimed to retrace Fawcett's intended route. Dyott's team was large and well supplied, a stark contrast to Fawcett's minimalist approach, but the jungle cared little for their numbers. They successfully located Dead Horse Camp, finding among the rusting cans and the skeletal remains of the pack animal a chilling artifact, Fawcett's own personal compass lodged in the mud. For a man of Fawcett's legendary navigational skill and meticulous discipline to abandon such a crucial instrument spoke volumes. It suggested a moment of sheer panic or utter catastrophe. Pushing onward, Dyott made contact with the Kalapalo tribe. The stories they told him through interpreters would become the cornerstone of the most enduring theory about the expedition's fate. The Kalapalo recounted the arrival of the three white men, describing the older leader as stern and refusing to heed their urgent warnings to turn back. They spoke of a final tragic night, claiming they saw the foreigners' campfires across the river extinguish one by one, never to be relit. In the morning, the men were gone. The Kalapalo's conclusion was stark. The intruders had been killed for their arrogance. As evidence, they presented Dyott with a silver identity disc that had belonged to Jack Fawcett and a small trunk filled with some of the group's personal effects. Dyott returned to civilization convinced he had solved the mystery, and his reports, splashed across front pages worldwide, offered a grim form of closure to a public desperate for answers. Yet, this supposed solution only served to ignite a far more dangerous and protracted second act. The story's potent mix of adventure and mystery proved an irresistible siren call for a specific breed of individual, the amateur adventurer. Over the following decades, a steady stream of these hopefuls, dubbed Fawcett freaks by the press, poured into the Mato Grosso. Most were hopelessly unprepared, armed with little more than a dog-eared copy of Fawcett's writings and a dangerous overabundance of confidence. The consequences were often tragic and predictably ironic. In 1932, a Russian journalist named Pavel Ponomarev vanished while searching for clues. A few years prior, a young American adventurer named Albert de Winton headed into the same region and was never seen again. The jungle that had swallowed the original party now began claiming the lives of those who sought to find them, adding a grim new layer to the legend and proving Fawcett's own dire prophecy that any rescue mission would be a death sentence. The quest also attracted more prominent and ultimately more tragic figures. Perhaps the most infamous was Peter Fleming, a journalist for the Times of London and the brother of Ian Fleming, the future creator of James Bond. In 1932, he led a large, well-equipped expedition that became a grueling farce. Plagued by incompetent guides, faulty equipment, and internal squabbles, Fleming's team accomplished little beyond getting hopelessly lost and nearly starving to death. He later chronicled the misadventure in his witty book Brazilian Adventure, which subtly mocked the entire Fawcett legend and his own naivete for pursuing it. His experience highlighted the vast chasm between the romantic ideal of exploration and its muddy, insect-ridden, and profoundly frustrating reality. The mid-20th century saw the mystery take an even stranger turn with the arrival of outright charlatans. The most notorious was a German-Brazilian adventurer named Karl Brugger, who in the 1970s met a tribesman calling himself Tatunkanara. This man spun an incredible yarn, claiming to be the son of Jack Fawcett, and spoke of a magnificent underground city called Akaka where his father and grandfather lived in enlightened splendor. Brugger wrote a best-selling book, The Chronicle of Akaka, which revitalized the mythos for a new generation. The story, however, completely unraveled upon investigation. Tatunkanara was eventually identified as a former German sailor named Gunther Hawk, a notorious hoaxer who was later implicated in the disappearances of several people who had the misfortune of following him into the jungle in search of his non-existent city. This dark episode demonstrated how the Fawcett legend could be weaponized by fantasy and malice, preying on the desperate and the gullible. Even into the late 20th century, the lure remained potent. In 1996, the wealthy Brazilian financier James Lynch mounted a multi-million-dollar expedition using helicopters and sophisticated ground-penetrating radar. His team, which included a documentary crew, aimed to be the one to finally solve the mystery. Instead, their mission nearly ended in disaster when their guides abandoned them and they were taken hostage by a nervous and hostile tribe, only being released after a tense, days-long negotiation. Lynch's experience was a stark reminder that despite GPS and satellite phones, the Amazon remained a place where ancient rules of territory and suspicion still applied, and where modern technology was often useless against the fundamental challenges of distrust and isolation. The most recent chapters of the search have shifted from grand adventures to quiet, scientific inquiry. In the 21st century, journalists like David Gran and archaeologists like Michael Heckenberger have returned to the region not with machetes and a thirst for glory, but with a desire to understand the cultural and historical context of Fawcett's quest. They have worked collaboratively with the descendants of the very tribes Fawcett encountered, such as the Kalapalo and the Kuikuro, piecing together oral histories and archaeological evidence. While this approach has not produced a single, definitive piece of evidence like a skeleton or a journal, it has provided a far more nuanced and probable explanation for the party's fate, one rooted in cultural misunderstanding and tragic circumstance rather than sensationalized violence or fantasy. The lasting impact of these countless searches is a complex legacy. They failed in their primary objective but succeeded in adding layers of drama, tragedy, and intrigue to a story that remains one of exploration's most compelling and enduring mysteries. The story of Percy Fawcett's disappearance possessed all the essential ingredients for a timeless narrative, ensuring its evolution from news report to full-blown cultural myth. This transformation was not instantaneous but unfolded over decades, finding its most powerful expression in literature and film, which would ultimately reframe the entire mystery for modern audiences. The journey from obscure historical footnote to global phenomenon can be traced directly through the creative works it inspired, each adaptation layering new interpretations onto the enduring enigma. The initial wave of attention came from the pulpy, sensationalized accounts in newspapers and adventure magazines of the 1930s and 40s, which often portrayed Fawcett as a dashing hero vanquished by savage forces. This simplistic view persisted for years, but it was the careful, dedicated work of his surviving son, Brian, that provided the first significant literary anchor for the legend. In 1953, Brian published Exploration Fawcett, a compilation of his father's own journals and letters. This book was far more than a memoir. It was an act of preservation, allowing Percy Fawcett to speak for himself from beyond the veil. Readers were given direct access to his meticulous observations, his soaring theories, and his very personal fears and hopes. This first-hand account provided a human depth to the story that newspaper clippings could never achieve, transforming the Colonel from a two-dimensional adventure cliché into a complex, driven, and strangely relatable figure. The book became a cornerstone text for armchair explorers and serious researchers alike, establishing the foundational narrative that all future works would either build upon or react against. The next great leap in the story's cultural journey arrived in 2005 with a groundbreaking article in The New Yorker by journalist David Grann. Grann did not set out to merely retell the story. He embarked on a meta-quest, intertwining the history of Fawcett's expedition with his own often comical attempt to retrace his steps into the Mato Grosso. This fresh, first-person perspective revitalized the tale, making it immediate and accessible. The article's success led to Grann's expansive biography, The Lost City of Z, published in 2009. The book was a masterpiece of narrative nonfiction, meticulously researched and beautifully written, that achieved something remarkable. It took a story that had often been dismissed as a quaint relic of a bygone era and revealed its profound contemporary relevance. Grann treated Fawcett not as a madman, but as a tragically flawed visionary, and he connected the explorer's theories to the cutting-edge archaeological discoveries that were finally proving the Amazon had indeed hosted complex societies. The book became a massive international bestseller, introducing the Fawcett saga to an entirely new generation and single-handedly catapulting the 90-year-old mystery back into the global spotlight. Grann's work shifted the public perception from what happened to Fawcett to a more profound question: was Fawcett actually right? This literary resurgence inevitably drew the attention of Hollywood, culminating in the 2017 major motion picture adaptation of The Lost City of Z, directed by James Gray and starring Charlie Hunnam as Percy Fawcett. The film took a decidedly artistic and philosophical approach to the material, choosing to focus less on jungle adventure, thrills, and more on the psychological contours of obsession, the tension between familial duty and boundless ambition, and the intoxicating allure of the unknown. It portrayed Fawcett's quest as a kind of spiritual awakening, a man becoming unmoored from the constraints of Edwardian society and drawn into a deeper, more primal reality. While the film took some creative liberties with the historical timeline, its emotional core was powerfully authentic. It presented the Amazon not just as a physical setting, but as a character in its own right, a beautiful, terrifying, and seductive force that mirrors Fawcett's own internal landscape. The movie's lush cinematography and meditative pace offered a visual and tonal interpretation that was very different from a typical action-adventure film, challenging audiences to engage with the story on a more thoughtful level. Its release ensured that the iconography of Fawcett, the pith helmet, the determined gaze, the cryptic map, was now cemented in the modern visual lexicon. Beyond the big-budget feature film, the story has been a fertile subject for documentarians, each tackling the mystery from a different angle. Some documentaries have focused forensically on the historical details, poring over maps, diaries, and archival footage to piece together the most likely sequence of events. Others have followed in the footsteps of later explorers, capturing the immense difficulty and danger of the terrain that claimed so many lives. The most impactful modern documentaries, however, have incorporated the perspectives that were almost entirely absent from the early accounts, the voices of the indigenous peoples of the Xingu region. By engaging anthropologists and listening to the oral histories of tribes like the Kalapalo, these films have added crucial layers of context and complexity. They explore the cultural misunderstandings that likely led to tragedy, moving the narrative away from simplistic notions of savagery and toward a more nuanced view of a clash between two utterly different worlds. This shift in perspective is perhaps the most significant evolution in how the story is told, transforming it from a colonial-era adventure into a poignant lesson about cultural arrogance and the perils of failing to listen. The collective impact of these books, films, and documentaries has been to create a feedback loop between perception and reality. The popular interpretations have shaped how we understand the historical facts, and in turn, new archaeological discoveries have reshaped the popular narratives. Fawcett has been portrayed as a heroic martyr to exploration, a deluded fool, a neglectful father, a visionary scientist, and a spiritual seeker. He is a mirror, and the culture looking into it sees its own values and anxieties reflected back. In an age of Google Earth where few physical frontiers remain, his story taps into a deep, universal yearning for a time when the world still held vast, blank spaces begging to be filled with our dreams and discoveries. The lost city of Z is no longer just a place, it is an idea. It represents the eternal human hope that there is still something magnificent left to find, that just beyond the edge of the map, a secret wonders waits for those brave enough to go looking. Percy Fawcett vanished, but in a final, ironic twist, the story he left behind ensured he would never truly be lost. The absence of any physical evidence only seemed to fuel more determined and often more outlandish attempts to provide it. For decades after the disappearance, a macabre cottage industry emerged, dedicated to producing relics and remains that promised to finally solve the mystery. The most famous of these, and perhaps the most thoroughly investigated, began in 1951, 26 years after Fawcett vanished, when a Brazilian official named Orlando Vilas Boas received a small, grim package. Inside were a few weathered bones claimed to be the skeletal remains of Colonel Percy Fawcett. The story from the Kalapalo tribesmen who provided them was detailed and somber. They recounted once more the fateful encounter, claiming that after the foreigners had been killed, their bodies were placed in the river. However, they said, they had later retrieved the bones of the older leader and had kept them for years as a kind of sacred cautionary totem. To the outside world, this seemed like the ultimate breakthrough, the final, physical piece of the puzzle. Orlando Vilas Boas, a highly respected explorer and anthropologist in his own right, arranged for the bones to be sent to England for expert analysis. The Fawcett family, particularly Brian Fawcett, awaited the results with a mix of dread and hope. Dread at the confirmation of their worst fears, but hope for the closure that had eluded them for so long. The remains were subjected to the most advanced forensic techniques available at the time. The examination, however, yielded a deeply frustrating and ambiguous result. The anthropologists concluded that the bones were not a match for Percy Fawcett. Crucially, they determined the skeleton was from a person significantly shorter and of a different build than the tall, lanky colonel. This finding should have closed the case, but in the world of the Fawcett mystery, nothing is ever so simple. Skeptics immediately questioned the analysis. They argued that the methods of the 1950s were far from foolproof and that decades in a tropical river could have warped and changed the bones. The Kalapalo's consistent and detailed story, told across multiple generations, held a powerful sway that a single scientific report could not completely erase. The story of the Fawcett bones is a perfect microcosm of the entire saga, a compelling narrative backed by first-hand testimony, ultimately undermined by a lack of definitive physical proof. It set a pattern that would repeat itself for years. Other artifacts surfaced with tantalizing claims. A nameplate or a compass would be discovered in a remote trading post, presented as proof of the party's passage, only to be dismissed as common equipment used by countless other explorers and rubber tappers in the decades that followed. The most outlandish claims came from charismatic charlatans like the German adventurer Karl Brugger and his fabricated native guide Tatanka Nara, who spun elaborate tales of the lost city of Akaka and claimed to be the son of Jack Fawcett. These stories were pure fantasy, but they were so audacious and romantic that they captured public imagination, further muddying the waters between fact and fiction. The fundamental problem with all of these alleged relics is the environment from which they supposedly came. The Amazon rainforest is one of the most efficient decomposition engines on the planet. Heat, humidity, insects, and acidic soils can reduce organic material to nothing in a matter of months. A body left exposed would be consumed completely. Metal objects would rust into unrecognizable lumps, leather would rot, and paper would dissolve. Even if the Kalapalo story is entirely true, the likelihood of finding any verifiable remains after nearly a century is astronomically low. This reality makes every new claim inherently suspect. Without a DNA match, an impossibility given the era and the lack of a confirmed sample from Fawcett himself, any artifact can only ever be considered circumstantial evidence at best and an elaborate hoax at worst. This relentless cycle of claim and debunking took a significant emotional toll on the Fawcett family. Each new discovery forced them to relive the trauma, whipping up a media frenzy that offered false hope before inevitably crashing down. Brian Fawcett, in particular, became a weary gatekeeper, forced to defend his father's memory against a parade of frauds and well-meaning but misguided enthusiasts. He learned to approach every new theory with a heavy dose of skepticism, a shield against the perpetual disappointment. The quest for physical proof, in many ways, became a distraction from the larger, more profound story of his father's life and legacy. It reduced a complex tale of obsession, courage, and visionary thinking to a simple treasure hunt for bones, missing the point of the quest entirely. The true relic of Percy Fawcett is not a skeleton in the jungle, but the indelible mark he left on the map of human curiosity, and the enduring question of what secrets the world's last wild places still hold. Fawcett's story forces us to confront a profoundly uncomfortable ethical question that lies at the heart of all historical exploration. What was the true cost of this quest for discovery, and who ultimately paid the price? While figures like Percy Fawcett are often celebrated as heroes of adventure, their journeys were built upon a foundation of colonial presumption and a deeply ingrained sense of cultural superiority. The very act of discovery implies that a place or a people were unknown, their existence unacknowledged, until a Western explorer arrived to document them for the world. This perspective completely erases the rich, complex lives and deep knowledge of the indigenous communities who had called these lands home for millennia. For the tribes of the Xingu, the Amazon was not an unknown wilderness waiting to be mapped. It was a known world, a carefully managed landscape filled with history, meaning, and social networks that were utterly invisible to the foreign eye. Fawcett did not walk into an empty space. He walked into someone's home, and his failure to fully grasp this distinction may have been his most critical oversight. This dynamic created a stark power imbalance that Fawcett, despite his genuine curiosity, could never fully overcome. He relied on indigenous guides for his very survival, using their intricate knowledge of river systems, safe paths, and edible plants to navigate the environment he so romanticized. Yet, this relationship was rarely one of equals. It was typically transactional, mediated by trade goods like knives, beads, and mirrors. There is a deep irony in a man searching for a lost civilization while being guided by the living descendants of that very civilization, yet viewing them more as instruments for his goal than as partners in a shared historical inquiry. His journals often speak of indigenous peoples with a mix of admiration for their physical hardiness and frustration at what he perceived as their superstitious or savage tendencies. He sought their stories about ancient ruins but filtered them through his own Western theosophical lens, often interpreting them as coded clues to a physical city rather than understanding them as living mythology and oral history integral to their cultural identity. The tragic potential for misunderstanding in such encounters cannot be overstated. The Kalapalo's account of the expedition's final days is a textbook case of a cultural collision with fatal consequences. Their offer of food was a fundamental gesture of peace and hospitality, a cornerstone of social interaction in their culture. The expedition's refusal to eat, likely born from a fear of poisoning or illness, was interpreted not as caution but as a grave insult and a sign of hostile intent. Similarly, Fawcett's potential shooting of the expedition's dog, an act he may have seen as necessary discipline, would have been viewed by the Kalapalo as a shocking and unpredictable act of violence against a loyal companion. Every action was filtered through a different cultural code, and without a shared framework for understanding, each misstep escalated the tension toward a tragic outcome. The explorers saw a barrier to their objective. The Kalapalo saw dangerous, disrespectful intruders who threatened the safety and social order of their entire community. Modern archaeology and anthropology are now slowly, and often painfully, attempting to redress this historical imbalance. The groundbreaking work of researchers like Michael Heckenberger in the Upper Xingu was only possible through genuine, long-term collaboration with the Guaycurú people, the direct descendants of the settlements he was studying. This approach flips the old colonial model on its head. Instead of extracting information and artifacts, the goal is to work alongside indigenous communities, respecting their knowledge, their connection to the land, and their right to control their own history and cultural heritage. This collaborative model has revealed a far richer and more accurate picture of the Amazon's past than any lone explorer could ever have uncovered. It acknowledges that the living cultures hold the keys to understanding the archaeological record, and that the most profound discoveries come not from imposing an external narrative, but from listening to the stories that have been told for generations. The legacy of explorers like Fawcett thus presents us with a complex duality. On one hand, his relentless drive and detailed record-keeping provided the outside world with its first glimpses into a profoundly different way of life. His theories, though mocked in his time, ultimately spurred the scientific inquiry that has vindicated the core idea of complex Amazonian societies. Yet, his story also serves as a permanent cautionary tale about the perils of arrogance and the critical importance of cultural humility. The greatest discovery he might have made was not a city of gold, but the realization that the true wisdom he sought was not lost in the ruins of the past, but alive in the people who stood before him. His failure to fully see them, to listen not just for clues but for meaning, is perhaps the most poignant lesson of all, reminding us that the most challenging frontier to cross is not a river or a mountain range, but the vast distance between one human perspective and another. The Amazon that Percy Fawcett ventured into in the early 20th century was a profoundly different world from the one we see today. It was an almost unimaginably vast and impenetrable wilderness, one of the last great blank spaces on the map. This was a green ocean, a place of constant, buzzing, crawling life that seemed to actively resist intrusion. For an explorer, the jungle was the ultimate adversary, a suffocating tangle of vegetation where visibility was often limited to a few feet, where every step was a battle against thorny vines and sucking mud, and where the air itself was a heavy, wet blanket teeming with malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Rivers were the only reliable highways, but they were perilous routes snaking through a landscape that offered no reference points, no high ground, and no certainty. This immense, cloaking density was both the guardian of the mystery and its greatest danger. It hid potential clues with incredible efficiency, swallowing paths, ruins, and even entire expeditions within a single rainy season. The very environment Fawcett sought to conquer was the very thing that made his quest so perilous and ultimately so enigmatic. He wasn't just fighting tribes or disease, he was fighting the jungle itself, an entity that seemed to have a will of its own. A century later, the battlefield has been utterly transformed, but the war is far from over. The modern Amazon is a place of stark contrasts and heartbreaking paradoxes. On one hand, the same technologies that have decrypted its secrets, satellite imagery and LiDAR, have also exposed its profound fragility. The relentless advance of deforestation for cattle ranching, soy farming, and logging has carved vast, bleeding scars into the green fabric of the basin. Where Fawcett saw only an unbroken canopy, we now see a patchwork of isolated forest fragments surrounded by agricultural land. This large-scale destruction has, in a cruel and ironic twist, inadvertently aided the archaeological pursuit Fawcett began. As bulldozers clear the land, they have occasionally exposed the very evidence he spent his life searching for: large geometric earthworks, ancient roads, and the distinct dark earth of long-vanished settlements known as terra preta. These discoveries have provided tangible, undeniable proof that complex societies did indeed manage and shape the Amazon landscape for centuries, vindicating the core of Fawcett's heretical theory. The tragedy is that this evidence is often uncovered only moments before it is itself destroyed by the very machinery that revealed it. This creates an agonizing race against time for archaeologists. They are forced to become first responders, rushing to newly cleared areas to document these fleeting glimpses into the past before they are plowed under forever. Each new dirt road etched into the rainforest represents both a potential clue and a permanent loss. While a cleared field might reveal the outline of a massive ceremonial circle, it also obliterates the subtle surrounding context, the smaller villages, the connecting paths, the managed groves of trees, that would tell the full story of how these societies lived and interconnected. We are gaining snapshots of a lost civilization at the exact same time we are ensuring its complete and final erasure. The modern threat isn't the jungle's ability to hide its secrets, but humanity's frantic rush to destroy the stage upon which those secrets were set, potentially burning the last clues to countless historical mysteries, including the ultimate fate of Percy Fawcett himself. This environmental context forces us to re-evaluate the entire nature of the mystery. Fawcett disappeared into a living, breathing fortress of biodiversity. Today, that fortress is under siege, and its crumbling walls are revealing hints of what it once protected. The dilemma we face is profound. The same processes that are helping to prove Fawcett was right in his broader beliefs are also ensuring that we may never find the specific, personal answer to what happened to him. The areas he was last known to be traveling through have been dramatically altered. The intricate network of trails known to indigenous guides, the specific clearings where he might have camped, the very rivers that may have claimed his remains, all have been subjected to a century of change, both natural and human-made. The Amazon of his journals is, in many places, simply gone, making the task of pinpointing his final resting place more difficult than ever. The jungle he feared and revered is now a threatened ecosystem, and its fading grandeur adds a new layer of poignant urgency to his story, transforming it from a historical puzzle into a stark reminder of what we stand to lose, both from our past and our future. Perhaps the most powerful reason this story endures is that it offers something far more valuable than a simple answer. It offers a perfect blank space for our imaginations to inhabit. A discovery of bones or a journal would provide closure, but it would also end the dream. The unresolved nature of Fawcett's fate allows each of us to choose our own ending. Do we believe in the tragic, pragmatic conclusion of a violent encounter in the jungle? Or do we lean into the more romantic notion that he found his city and chose a different path, becoming part of the very mystery he sought to solve? This ambiguity is a powerful narrative engine. It transforms the story from a historical event into a living myth, one that we can continually reshape to reflect our own desires for adventure, enlightenment, or even escape from the modern world. In an age where satellites have mapped every inch of the planet, Fawcett's Vanishing act preserves the thrilling illusion that some corners of the Earth can still swallow a person whole, guarding their secrets forever. Furthermore, the saga taps into a deep, almost primal human archetype, the hero's journey into the unknown from which he never returns. This is a story pattern found in countless myths and legends across cultures, from Orpheus descending into the underworld to figures like King Arthur sailing to Avalon. Fawcett seamlessly stepped into this ancient role. He wasn't just an explorer, he became a modern-day Icarus whose soaring ambition led him too close to the sun. His story carries the weight of classical tragedy, a great man brought down by the very quality that made him great, his unyielding obsession. This mythic resonance elevates his disappearance from a mere news item to a timeless tale about the price of hubris and the eternal human tension between the safety of the known and the irresistible lure of the forbidden. We are captivated because on some level we recognize the story. It feels familiar because it is written into our very understanding of what it means to strive for something beyond our grasp. On a cultural level, Fawcett's story arrived at a pivotal moment and perfectly captured a generational mood. His final expedition launched in 1925, a time when the world was still reeling from the unprecedented mechanized slaughter of the First World War. The romantic ideals of empire, progress, and European superiority had been shattered in the trenches. In this climate of disillusionment, Fawcett represented a purer, more noble form of adventure. His quest wasn't for territorial conquest or wealth, it was for knowledge and lost wisdom. He was seen as a throwback to a more virtuous age of exploration, a lone individual relying on courage and determination rather than industrial machinery. His disappearance, then, felt like the loss of that innocence itself. He became a symbol of a world that was fading away, swallowed by the same unknowable wilderness that had always defined the limits of human understanding. The mystery offered an escape from a grim modern reality into a world where individual courage still mattered and where great mysteries were still possible. The enduring fascination is also fueled by the very human drama at the story's heart, the poignant element of a father and son vanishing together. This isn't just the story of a lone adventurer, it's a family tragedy. The image of Percy Fawcett, determined to cement his legacy, taking his eager son Jack into the abyss with him, adds an almost unbearable emotional weight. It raises difficult, haunting questions about responsibility, sacrifice, and the limits of obsession. Would Jack have gone if not for his father's powerful influence? Was he a willing partner in the quest or a loyal son following a path he felt compelled to walk? This familial dimension makes the story relatable on a gut level. It's not just about maps and ruins, it's about the bonds between parents and children, the passing of dreams from one generation to the next, and the devastating cost those dreams can sometimes demand. We are drawn to the human element, to the personal stakes that make the historical mystery feel intimately real and profoundly sad. Finally, Fawcett's story remains relevant because it is ultimately a mirror. It reflects our own changing relationship with the unknown and our evolving understanding of history. For decades, he was the central figure, the heroic explorer. But as our perspective has shifted, so has the story. Today, we are just as captivated by the narratives of the Kalapalo and other Amazonian tribes, the people who are always there, who watched the explorers arrive, and who have their own intricate histories and truths. The mystery now is not only what happened to Fawcett, but also how we can reconcile different ways of knowing and remembering the past. Fawcett's legacy is no longer just a tale of a missing man. It is a catalyst for a much larger conversation about colonialism, cultural arrogance, and the rediscovery of indigenous knowledge. We are still trying to solve his mystery, but in doing so, we are also unraveling our own assumptions about discovery itself, proving that the most compelling secrets are often not about places, but about people and the stories they choose to tell. Percy Fawcett's story is far more than a captivating mystery. It serves as a foundational lesson, a complex case study that fundamentally reshaped the very philosophy of exploration for the modern era. His disappearance forced a painful but necessary reckoning, moving the practice from a romantic, individualistic pursuit of glory toward a more collaborative, respectful, and scientifically rigorous discipline. The shift wasn't immediate, but the specter of the lone colonel vanishing into the green, along with the dozens of Fawcett freaks who followed him to their doom, became a powerful cautionary tale. It highlighted the catastrophic cost of unchecked obsession and the profound fallacy of the conquering hero narrative. Modern exploration, in response, has had to learn a delicate dance how to retain the thrilling spirit of adventure that Fawcett embodied while tempering it with a humility and preparation he often lacked, ensuring that the quest for discovery does not come at the expense of human life or cultural respect. This evolution is perhaps most visible in the critical balance between adventure and safety. Fawcett's minimalist approach, which he saw as a tactical advantage, would be considered recklessly negligent by today's standards. Sending 3 men into one of the most remote and hazardous environments on Earth with no reliable means of communication was an extraordinary gamble. Today, technology has irrevocably altered that calculus. Satellite phones, GPS trackers, and personal locator beacons provide a vital lifeline to the outside world, allowing modern expeditions to manage risk without completely eliminating the challenge. The goal is no longer to prove one's toughness by shunning all aids, but to ensure that calculated risks are taken and that if something goes wrong, as it so often did for Fawcett, a rescue is at least possible. This isn't about making exploration safe. It's about making it responsible, acknowledging that the greatest discovery is worthless if the discoverers don't live to tell the tale. Furthermore, Fawcett's greatest failure was arguably not navigational but cultural. He entered the Amazon as a representative of a colonial mindset, viewing the landscape as a blank space to be mapped and its people either as obstacles to be avoided or instruments to be used. His inability to fully comprehend the social complexities and territorial realities of the indigenous tribes was likely a direct contributor to his fate. Modern explorers and researchers have built upon this hard lesson by placing collaborative partnership at the core of their work. They understand that the deepest secrets of a place are often held by the people who have lived there for generations. Figures like archaeologist Michael Heckenberger didn't march into the Xingu with a pre-planned route. They built relationships with the Kukuro people, earning trust and working alongside them as partners. This approach flips the script entirely. It recognizes that local communities are not part of the environment to be managed. They are the foremost experts on it. Their oral histories, their knowledge of the land, and their guidance are not mere tools for the explorer's goal, but are invaluable components of the discovery process itself. This shift from extraction to collaboration is the most significant and positive legacy of Fawcett's tragedy. The tools of discovery have also been revolutionized, moving far beyond the compass and sextant. Fawcett spent years trudging through the undergrowth, hoping to literally stumble upon his city. Today, explorers can use satellite imagery and LiDAR technology to digitally peel back the forest canopy from an office thousands of miles away, identifying promising archaeological sites with pinpoint accuracy before ever setting foot in the jungle. This doesn't remove the adventure. The ground truthing, the excavation, and the immersive work remain intensely physical and demanding, but it makes the search infinitely more efficient and far less perilous. It allows researchers to ask bigger, more sophisticated questions about how ancient societies interconnected and managed their landscapes, moving beyond the search for a single lost city to understand an entire lost civilization. In this sense, modern explorers are fulfilling Fawcett's wildest dream, but they are doing so with a methodology he could never have conceived, one that prioritizes broad understanding over a singular, trophy-like discovery. Ultimately, Percy Fawcett's true legacy is a paradox. He is remembered both for the grandeur of his vision and for the hubris that doomed it. Modern explorers build upon his legacy by embracing the first while consciously rejecting the second. They channel his boundless curiosity and his willingness to believe in the impossible, but they temper it with ethical responsibility, scientific rigor, and a deep respect for the people and places they seek to understand. The romantic ideal of the lone wolf explorer has largely been retired, replaced by interdisciplinary teams comprising scientists, local guides, linguists, and community leaders. The quest is no longer for personal glory or to prove a theory to a skeptical establishment, but to collectively expand human knowledge in a way that is sustainable and respectful. Fawcett's story endures because it is the foundational myth of this evolution, a dramatic, poignant reminder of how far we have come, and a permanent warning against the dangers of venturing into the unknown without first checking your own assumptions. And so we are left with the echo of a question, a mystery as deep and enveloping as the Amazon rainforest itself. Percy Fawcett and his quest for the lost city of Z have transcended the fate of one man to become something far greater, a permanent symbol of the human spirit's relentless drive to seek answers in the unknown. His story is a profound paradox, a tale of both spectacular failure and stunning vindication. For decades, he was dismissed as a deluded fool, a man chasing phantoms conjured from bad maps and jungle fever. Yet, the most incredible twist in this century-old enigma is that the core of his life's work, the belief for which he was ridiculed, has been proven resoundingly correct. He was right. The Amazon was not a pristine wilderness, but the carefully managed garden of a sophisticated, advanced civilization. He was simply looking for the wrong kind of ruins, seeking stone towers in a world built of earth and wood, a world that returned to the forest the moment its people were gone. This posthumous validation, revealed through the eye of satellite technology and LiDAR, forces us to re-evaluate the very nature of discovery. Fawcett's obsession was not in vain, it was merely ahead of its time. He represents the tragic gap between intuition and proof, between a visionary's belief and the world's willingness to accept it. His legacy is a powerful reminder that the boundaries of human knowledge are not fixed, that today's heresy can become tomorrow's established fact. It challenges us to wonder how many other visionaries throughout history, dismissed in their own era, were actually pointing toward a truth the world wasn't yet ready to see. Yet his story is also a permanent cautionary tale, a sobering reflection on the fine line between visionary determination and all-consuming obsession. Fawcett's unshakable faith was the engine of his ambition, but it also became the blindfold that may have prevented him from seeing the real dangers and cultural complexities right in front of him. His journey compels us to ask ourselves where that line lies for each of us. What are we willing to sacrifice in pursuit of a dream? When does passion become fanaticism? And what responsibilities do we owe to those who follow us into the unknown? He vanished not in a blur of action, but in a quiet, immense silence, leaving behind a void that we have spent a century trying to fill with our own theories, our own hopes, and our own searches. Perhaps the most enduring power of this mystery is that it remains stubbornly a blank space on our map of understanding. In a world that feels increasingly mapped, measured, and explained, the idea that a story of this magnitude can simply end in silence is both terrifying and thrilling. It preserves the romantic notion that some secrets are too powerful to be found, that some corners of the world still guard their mysteries fiercely. Fawcett's ultimate gift is this enduring question mark. It invites us to keep wondering, to keep questioning, and to remain humble in the face of all we do not know. He became a permanent part of the very mystery he sought to solve, a ghost in the machine of exploration, forever walking just ahead of us into the deep green, urging us to look closer, to dig deeper, and to never stop believing that the greatest discoveries often begin with the courage to be lost.